You're watching France 24. Let's bring you the main news headlines on today's programme. France announces the death of a top jihadist leader in Mali. France trying to reassure the West African nation of European support in the fight against militant bloodshed. The government here in France set to today announce a series of measures signalling a tougher line on immigration, amongst them a system of quotas for economic immigrants and a limiting of healthcare access. I'm going to talk to our correspondent Chris Moore. He'll bring us the very latest very shortly. And the US ambassador to the EU updates his testimony to lawmakers, saying he now remembers telling Ukrainian officials it was likely they would not get nearly $400 million in security aid unless they pursue investigations demanded by President Donald Trump. Glad you could join us then. We're live from Paris here on France 24. I'm Stuart Norval. Also coming up for you in this half hour of the programme, in business today, why French farmers and agri-food companies will be celebrating some of the announcement made during President Macron's visit to China. And Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg. I'm not talking about Brexit for once, but this is the biggest fireworks and bonfire night of the year in the UK, as effigies, in fact, are burnt right across the country. He became known then as the second most wanted terrorist across the Sahel region of North Africa. Now, though, France has announced the death of the Moroccan Ali Meichou of the group to support Islam and Muslims in Mali, been killed by French troops. The death coming right as France really seeks to reassure the West African nation of European support in the fight against militant bloodshed. This report now from Wassim Cornet.
He was one of the top jihadist leaders in Western Africa and the mastermind behind several deadly attacks in the region. Ali Meichou of the Group to Support Islam and Muslims, or GSIM, was killed by French troops in Mali last month near Timbuktu. The news was broken by French Defense Minister Florence Parly as she returned from an official visit to the region.
On October 9th, France killed the GSIM's second-in-command in the Sahel. Ali Meichou, a religious leader, recruiter, and the mastermind behind several large-scale attacks, was a hate-monger.
Parly explained that Meichou was the second most wanted terrorist in the Sahel, including by the United States. The GSIM encompasses several jihadist groups linked to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM. The group has claimed responsibility for some of the biggest attacks in the Sahel since it was founded 2 years ago. One of them was the Ouagadougou attack in March 2018. The assault on the headquarters of Burkina Faso's military, as well as the French embassy, left 8 people dead. More recently, between 40 and 85 soldiers were killed in an attack by the GSIM on a Malian army camp near Boulikessi in September. Mali's army has been struggling to contain the jihadist uprising, despite help from France as well as African neighbors. France has deployed 4,500 men in the region as part of its Barkhane force, but it has struggled to convince European partners to take part in the operation.
So they've opened a major new museum, a branch of the Pompidou Centre in Shanghai. They've talked trade and signed a series of huge business deals. And they've even talked environment and the need to further pursue measures to meet the Paris climate change deal. Let's hear first, though, what Macron had to say on climate change as he came towards the end of his visit to Xi Jinping in China.
We have acted together concerning global warming constantly over the last 2 years, and have done so with a great deal of efficiency and commitment. I deplore choices made by certain others, but I want to see those choices as marginal. When you look at China, the EU and Russia, which ratified the Paris Climate Agreement some weeks ago, then the isolated choice made by such and such another is not enough to change the path the world is taking. It only leads to marginalization.
Emmanuel Macron there. What they've not done yet, though, is to address any of the, well, if you like, elephants in the room. Human rights, of course, amid the Hong Kong and Uyghur crises. A press conference held earlier on with no mention still of them, although a second press conference, this time we expect with questions from journalists, is expected at the French embassy in the next hour in China. That could change that. But earlier on, I spoke to correspondent Charles Pellegrin in Beijing. He told me no surprise that there's been no mention so far.
Not surprised that Emmanuel Macron did not bring up any of those taboo subjects that are making headlines about China around the world. Things like the Hong Kong protests there that have been going on since June, or the massive internment campaign against the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang. After all, the French president was at the heart of the Chinese Communist Party's power on Tiananmen Square. He was not going to tackle these issues head-on in public to possibly as well save face. He's having another press conference later in the day at the French embassy. Maybe those topics will be addressed, especially because journalists will be able to ask questions at that press conference. But other announcements obviously made over the signature of contracts in a number of different sectors: aeronautic, spatial, space or agriculture, and as well that cooperation on climate, trying to be more ambitious in reducing emissions and protecting biodiversity. And this at a time when the United States is withdrawing from the Paris Accords. There was definitely a sense that because of the United States isolationism and protectionism, this has made closer ties between China and the European Union bloc.
Charles Pellegrin there in Beijing, and as I say, that second press conference then due in the next hour. They were running a little bit late earlier on, but in theory anyway, within the next hour. Now, the government of Emmanuel Macron under pressure here in France as it announces a series of moves designed to tackle migrants. Now, critics accusing the government of pandering to the far right. Well, let's find out more. Our correspondent Chris Moore joins us now from Matignon. That's the official residence of the Prime Minister here in France, where the announcements are due to be made. Chris, just first of all, tell us exactly what we're expecting to hear today.
Well, first of all, French officials have been talking in recent days about migration quotas, a new departure for the country following in the footsteps of the likes of Canada and Australia. This, as they're set to unveil 20 measures on the immigration issue, many of them, as you said, looking to toughen up the system, making it harder for the families of migrants to join them in France, restricting access to medical care. Now, Emmanuel Macron has been pilloried for all of this on the political left. They accuse him of adopting an idea long advocated by right-wing politicians. On the nationalist right, he's obviously also come under criticism for effectively not going far enough. Now, in terms of those quotas, the French government is likely to say it's aimed at making what is currently a cumbersome system firm but fair, and actually making it easier for economic migrants in key sectors where there's a labour shortfall here in France to get into the country, sectors like catering, but also white-collar professions like IT and engineering. Important not to get mixed up between the issue of legal economic migration into France and the wider issue of immigration and asylum seeking in Europe. On that front, the French president liked to trot out the message which was put out over the last few years, namely that it shouldn't be left up to the likes of France, Germany, Western European nations to welcome all of the new arrivals. In terms of those who have been allowed to stay in Europe, it's time that Eastern European nations, foremost amongst them Hungary and Poland, also step up to the plate.
Chris, have you been counting? The next election here in France is due in 2022, isn't it? And the polls still seem to be showing that this is likely to be a battle between Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen in the second round. Cynics might say there's a bit of a link between what you're talking about, that and this.
There might is, of course, still a very long way off, and that poll giving Emmanuel Macron a second-round victory, albeit by a vastly reduced margin. That, however, as you say, is very much the context, and surprise, surprise, we've seen Macron getting involved in a renewed debate about the Islamic headscarf, about immigration, giving an interview to the very conservative magazine Valeurs Actuelles, again being pilloried on the left for treading on ground set out by Marine Le Pen. Whatever you think of Mr. Macron, he is a pragmatist, and he's likely to reason that if she's likely to go there, which, let's face it, she is, then he probably has to too. The irony of it all is that if you look at other surveys, issues of immigration and asylum are actually very low down the list of French voters' concerns. They're much more worried about their job prospects and the economy.
Chris, thanks very much. Chris Moore, correspondent, joining us there from central Paris. Now, Ukraine will not get nearly $400 million in security aid unless they pursue investigations demanded by President Donald Trump. That the testimony of what a US diplomat, Gordon Sondland, is said to have told a Ukrainian official. Sondland, the US ambassador to the EU. Now, he initially testified back in October, offering now new details to lawmakers after his memory, he said, was refreshed. The details then appearing to bolster the initial whistleblower complaint that has led to the investigation. Brian Quinn reports.
An ambassador's memory suddenly refreshed. In a reversal of his previous testimony, U.S. Ambassador to the EU Gordon Sondland now says he told a Ukrainian official that critical U.S. military aid would only be delivered when Kiev announced it had launched anti-corruption investigations against Donald Trump's political rivals.
I said that resumption of U.S. aid would likely not occur until Ukraine provided the public anti-corruption statement that we had been discussing for many weeks.
Sondland had previously testified that there was no political motivation behind Trump's decision to withhold from Kiev $400 million in U.S. funding aimed at helping Ukraine hold off pro-Russian rebels in the country's northeast. His reversal now appears to establish a quid pro quo, an explicit exchange of favors in which Trump used taxpayer dollars and U.S. foreign policy to pressure a foreign government to interfere in the upcoming U.S. presidential election. In a statement, the White House disputed that interpretation.
Ambassador Sondland squarely states that he did not know and still does not know when, why, or by whom the aid was suspended.
The congressional impeachment inquiry was sparked by a whistleblower complaint over a July 25th phone call between Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in which Trump asked Zelensky to open an investigation against the Democrat Joe Biden and his son Hunter. Republicans and Trump allies have tried to paint the investigation as a partisan attack triggered and sustained by so-called never-Trumpers. But Sondland's testimony seems to refute that angle. The ambassador is a longtime Trump supporter and political appointee. Up to now, the inquiry has been held behind closed doors. Democrats are pushing for public hearings to begin as early as next week.
Now, US Democrats are claiming an upset win in the US state of Kentucky, and a win over Republican governors strongly backed by President Donald Trump. The Democrats scoring a narrow victory and almost complete results over Governor Matt Bevin. The outcome of elections in 4 states, including Mississippi and New Jersey, observers say, offering clues to how next year's presidential elections could unfold. Little good news for Donald Trump. Now, to a slight calming in the protests in Chile, as the number of people gathering to demand better salaries and pensions drew just up to 2,500 people. Now, the same square earlier in the demonstrations actually hosted 1.2 million protesters. The latest protest, though, will a day after more violent clashes between the police and demonstrators. Onka Ula has more.
With his approval ratings at record lows and an unprecedented political crisis engulfing his country, Chile's president broke a days-long silence, promising to remain in his post until the end of his term in 2022.
There are calls for you to resign. Will you?
No. Let me tell you something about Chile. 30 years ago, we recovered our democracy in an exemplary way. Since then, we have been able to reduce poverty from 65% to 8%. That is a success story.
But the streets tell a different story. Sebastián Piñera's detractors say social inequality in the country has gotten out of control. Nearly 3 weeks in, the protest movement has not lost steam. On Tuesday, violent clashes broke out again between law enforcement and protesters.
I think the violence is born from the system. It's not something people want, but it emerges due to the deep inequalities and the larger number of people who feel abandoned.
The president hasn't proposed any dialogue, and he decided to send his soldiers out on the streets like taking dogs for a walk. This is serious.
Despite the government announcing a series of measures, hardcore protesters will accept nothing short of the president's resignation. They accuse the billionaire of being out of touch with the struggling population. Others, including the opposition, want to reform the constitution, which dates back to the Pinochet military dictatorship.
Now, Chileans and Argentines have taken to the streets in Argentinian capital Buenos Aires to protest against Chile's government. Demonstrators marching down the street close to Buenos Aires' central obelisk, banging drums and holding up banners against the government of Sebastián Piñera. Now then, if you're British like me, you'll know that last night was the biggest night of the year for fireworks and bonfires. Bonfire Night, as it is known remember, in fact, the uncovering of Guy Fawkes' gunpowder plot to blow up the Houses of Parliament right back in 1605 it was, in fact. And the country's biggest bonfire night, traditionally held in the southern small town of Lewis, where thousands of people pack the small streets to watch the torchlight parade. And of course, the big stories of the moment are always reflected in some of the effigies. Hopefully any second now, there he is. We'll get Boris Johnson seen riding a Brexit roller coaster, and also the leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, paraded through the streets. Not sure if they set light to them afterwards, but possibly. Other slightly more fictional characters as well, including Neptune there. It is a very spectacular demonstration firework display there in Lewis. Happens every year. You're watching live from Paris.